Hey everyone, welcome back to Music Appreciation. Today we're taking a look at Chapter 59, Sonata Number 2 by John Cage. So according to our music history timeline here, I always like to begin there. We're still working within the 20th century. By this point we've reached about the very midpoint of the century, about the 1950s. And we're looking at a piece by a composer named John Cage, who lived very squarely in the 20th century, who lived from 1912 to 1992. He is an American composer, which is important to note. It really wasn't until we reached the 20th century in this course that we began talking about American musicians, especially in light of ragtime and jazz, which is considered to be really America's classical music. So by the 20th century, for the first time, we start to see a lot of American composers making unique contributions and making a name for themselves on the international stage. So American classical music really kind of comes into its own during this time period. So John Cage is a composer of avant-garde music, which is another way of saying something that's experimental or completely new. And he's considered to be one of the most influential composers of the entire century, especially out of American composers. So what makes his music avant-garde? It's because he explores both new sources for sound and also entirely new definitions of music. So he's one of the first composers who pushes other composers to actually rethink the definition of music, reconceptualize what music even is, and also forces you as the listener, or challenges you as the listener, to kind of expand your mind and your concept of what music can be. So I've listed here three of his major contributions to the field of music. The first one would be the use of prepared instruments, and that's what we're going to be looking at for today. So I'll explain the definition of that in just a minute here. But he also pioneered the creation of aleatoric music. And if you are familiar with Latin at all, aleatoric comes from the root alea or alea. And that is the word meaning dice, like to play with dice, to play a game of chance. So that's music that has some sort of element of chance or spontaneity within it. And I think we'll see a bit of that today as well. And he also pioneered extra musical sounds. So extra means kind of beyond. Above and beyond. So he's pioneering the use of sounds that hadn't typically been considered to be musical. So he's exploring the difference between sound and music, and messing with your expectations a little bit. So we talk about sound or noise as being something kind of extraneous and maybe unintended. If you think of somebody like dropping a book on a desk, is that music? What if that person says it's music and then organizes it into some sort of rhythmic pattern? Then does it become music? So he looks at using lots of natural elements as well. He's interested in exploring nature and taking bits of nature like water and shells and plants and transforming those into musical instruments. So we're not going to get into really aleatoric or extra musical sounds today. But I will note, in case you're interested in exploring these, on our music appreciation playlist that I've been keeping up all semester, I've added a couple interesting John Cage pieces. He is also famous, as you may recall, for writing the piece 433, which is 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. But I've included examples of Water Walk, which incorporates lots of unusual aspects that you might find in your home, like a bathtub and a flower pot and a blender and a rubber ducky and a radio and all sorts of bizarre things. Also, Child of Tree is a great piece that incorporates aspects of nature. So you'll see the performers playing with kind of dried out leaves, gourds, seed pods, and also my favorite is the amplified cactus, in which they actually attach an amplifier to a cactus and then pluck the cactus's spines or needles as to make a kind of a percussion instrument. So very interesting uses of non-musical sounds. Okay, so let's explore a little bit about John Cage's musical philosophy because, as you might already guess from what I've said, it's quite unusual. So John Cage once wrote that the word music is sacred and reserved for 18th and 19th century instruments. And when he says sacred here, I think he means that almost in sort of a sarcastic way, or saying that this is something that's been unchallenged and bound to tradition for the last 2 centuries. And now that we've reached the 20th century and experienced this modernist movement, it's time for us to move on and explore new aspects. So he says instead, modern composers, and himself particularly, they're really organizers of sound. So not just with the entire field of sound, but also with time. So completely expanding and blowing up everything we ever believed about music. So moving beyond music, which holds a kind of a set of assumptions. When you think about music, there's things that you expect, there's instruments that come to mind, and he's saying we need to free ourselves from those. And this sounds very kind of abstract and kind of intellectualist, but really he had a great sense of humor about all of his music. He really seemed to have a joy for life, and he recognized that a lot of listeners may not like this music, or they may find it just weird or funny, and he was okay with that. So that's why I chose this picture of him with the cat. He just seems to be happy there. Another excerpt here from his sort of musical philosophy. He says, the present methods of writing music, principally those which employ harmony and its reference to particular steps in the field of sound, and when he says harmony and its reference to particular steps, he's really referring to our traditional system of music, our traditional tonal scales, the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, using traditional instruments and traditional genres. He's saying that will be inadequate for the composer, who will be faced with the entire field of sound. And he also liked to use traditional instruments like the piano in unusual ways. So that's also why I chose this picture right here. He's sitting at a toy piano. So this is a small miniature piano built for children to play around with, not actually supposed to be a real instrument. And he actually wrote several pieces for the toy piano and would perform it kind of sitting at this teeny tiny little piano. So a bit of humor in there. So now I would ask you to please listen to this piece of music once through, maybe go to My Lab and listen to it and ask yourself these 3 questions. What instrument or instruments are you hearing? Can you pick out a main melody or repeated sections? And also be thinking about rhythm. Can you discern a clear beat? Are there certain rhythms that are repeated? How is this structured? What makes it different or avant-garde? So I'll ask you to pause here, listen to that, and then we'll come back and talk about it. Okay, so you may have noticed that there seems to be kind of a bunch of different instruments that you're hearing. It may sound like a piano, it may sound like some drums or some bongos, maybe something like thudding against a wall, maybe gongs or chimes. And it's very easy to think that maybe we're hearing multiple instruments happening, but in fact it is just one instrument, and it's the piano. And this is what's known as a prepared piano. So to prepare a piano is to place place objects on or between the piano strings. So as you see in this picture to the right, this is the interior of the piano where the lid has been lifted up to expose the strings. And as you can see, it looks like bits of rubber, maybe erasers, have been placed in between the strings, on top of the strings. We can see what looks like maybe nails or screws, bolts have also been placed between the strings. And the effect of this is that it interferes with the movement of the strings, the vibration of the strings, and results in lots of different timbral qualities that you wouldn't normally expect from a piano. So sometimes it completely mutes the string and makes it sound softer. Sometimes it dulls it to the point of just being kind of an unpitched sort of thud sound. Sometimes it causes it to ring and resonate because of the metal. So we get all of these different sounds and pitches that we wouldn't normally hear. So this creates what I consider to be a kind of a percussive effect. And Cage developed this prepared piano technique actually kind of out of necessity. The story is that he was commissioned to write a piece for a ballet or for some sort of modern dance, and the choreographer wanted him to write a piece for an percussion ensemble, so multiple percussionists at once. But the problem is that the performance was going to happen on a very small stage that couldn't fit both dancers and an entire percussion orchestra. So he tinkered around for a while and figured out that he could actually turn, by preparing the piano, he could actually turn it into sort of a percussive orchestra in and of itself, and that saved space and also personnel as well. And just a side note here, in case this looks interesting to you, please don't do this without some sort of like professional supervision, because it can break strings or hurt the piano in some way. There's really like a certain protocol that goes into preparing a piano, and the main rule is that this all must be reversible. You must be able to remove all of these objects and use it as a normal piano afterwards. So returning to our playlist here, if prepared piano is something that sounds interesting to you, you'd like to learn more about it, I've included here a link to a video by Stephen Drury at the New England Conservatory, so one of the best piano technicians in the country, and he actually explains how to prepare a piano to play this particular piece we're looking at today. And you'll see it's really a fascinating process, very involved. It takes about 3 or 4 hours to do, so it really needs a professional. Okay, so some background on this piece. It's Sonata number 2, but it comes out of a collection of multiple sonatas, and he calls it the Sonatas and Interludes from the year 1948, so right mid-century. And this is an interesting use of prepared piano and both normal piano as well. So not every one of the strings of the piano have been prepared, so you do get some normal piano pitched sounds, but you also get a lot of these other percussive sounds as well. So there's a nice range and variation in timbre or tone color. He also mostly uses the upper range of the piano, so kind of keeps it separate from one another. And interestingly, he provides very detailed preparation instructions, and I'll show you those on the next slide here. But he also was always very open-minded and kind of easygoing, and he said, if you enjoy playing the sonatas and interludes, then do it so that it seems right to you. So he says, I'm not the end-all be-all. Make this your own. Explore on your own. So here, a small snippet of the instructions. They're really pretty long in total, but you can see he's included the pitches, what type of object to put on the strings. So here we have a screw, some bit of plastic, a bolt, some rubber, and he tells you where exactly on the string you should put it. So it's very carefully measured. But there's also still an aspect of spontaneity or chance, that aleatoric concept, in that he says bolt or screw, but he doesn't indicate what type. So there are many different types of bolts and screws. They're just different weights, sizes, thread spacing, materials. You could do different types of metals, and each one of those is going to result in a different sound. Same with rubber. There's many different sources, sizes, types of rubber. So each and every performance of these sonatas and interludes is going to sound completely different. It's all kind of up to chance. Okay. So now that you hopefully have listened to the recording from my lab, let's compare and contrast that with another performance here. And this one we can actually see it being performed. And I like this video because it actually zooms in and out of the piano, so you can actually see the preparation objects within the piano. So we'll watch just a bit of this. And here I'll note that you can actually see the notation, and it's traditional normal notation, even though the music itself does not sound that way. So from the performer's perspective, it really is kind of disconcerting to be playing notes that are written on the page and hearing completely different notes. So it's very difficult for the performer as well. Okay, so I'm going to pause it there. This video is also included in our class playlist, so if you'd like to watch the whole thing, it's there. But I wanted to use that as sort of a point of comparison because it sounds a lot different than the performance included through MyLab. And again, that's that aleatoric aspect that there's always an element of chance. There's a lot left up to the performer. So now to kind of debrief on the timbre, melody, and rhythm that I asked you to listen for initially. So timbre is very important here because we've clearly changed the timbre of the piano. So for reference, each piano key has 2 to 3 strings. So when you press one key on the piano for the note C, for example, you may be pressing down actually either simultaneously 2 or 3 strings. And that allows you many opportunities to alter the timbre of the very same pitch. So there's so many opportunities to change everything here. So the use here in this particular case of screws, bolts, metal nuts, strips of plastic and rubber, pencil erasers, all of these lend different qualities. And one more time, returning to our class playlist here. If you're interested in seeing kind of modern uses of the prepared piano, I'd encourage you to listen to this performance here, Hauschka performing his NPR or improvisation for the NPR channel. And he is working today using the same technique, but creating quite different music. And he really even further expands the use of prepared objects. So we get like a tambourine, ping pong balls, tic tacs, paper clips, and clothespins, and all sorts of interesting things to create a really beautiful haunting piece of music. So there are certainly many different ways that this can be done, and people who are still exploring it. And also to kind of mention here melody and rhythm, because this essentially turns the piano into a percussion ensemble, there is a heavy emphasis on rhythm, I think more so than a melodic quality. So there's not a great melody that can get stuck in your head. There are short fragments of melodies that return occasionally, but really here we're interested in varying timbres in different rhythmic orientations. As I mentioned, each performance is going to sound slightly different because preparation kind of inherently introduces variation. It's an aleatoric aspect. And finally, we hear both pitched and unpitched notes, meaning some pitches, or excuse me, some notes, when the keys, when they're pressed, they just sound like a dull kind of thud without any actual pitch to them. And others still ring out like gongs or chimes. So we get a nice mixture of both pitched and unpitched, which also emphasizes rhythm. So I hope you enjoyed John Cage. He's a fascinating character in American classical music. And please do take some time and explore on YouTube. Start here with what I've put. Look around for yourself. He's just a really fun composer who kind of changes everything we've ever expected about music. All right, thank you for listening.